Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today, I'm taking a break from all the fantasy novels that I've been covering for, I want to say, 6 weeks now, and I'm going to be covering this book, The Flight of the Iguana, written by David Quammen. The subtitle says, A Sidelong View of Science and Nature. This is my second rant of a book by David Quammen, as far as I know. I can't think of another one by him aside from the boilerplate Rhino. And this is, like that one, a collection of essays. The author's note says each of these essays was first published in similar or slightly different form in a magazine. But that is not quite the same, please note, as saying they were all written for magazines. On the contrary, most of them were written to be eventually part of this book. At least they were conceived and shaped, though for magazine publication initially, with this book ultimately in mind. The large majority appeared first as installments of the monthly column I write under the title Natural Acts for Outside Magazine. Now, the copy I have is specifically from 1998, but this book was first published in copyright in 1988. This illustration copyright is by Chris Ellingsen, and this is the first Touchstone edition from 1998. Now, the introduction does a fair job of describing the point of this book. It almost feels like a thesis, but most of these stories are not connected to each other. So really what we are looking at is a collection of themes, probably because that's the mood he was feeling back in the 80s when writing these articles. Two primary subjects tangle their way through this book. First, the surprising intricacies of the natural world, and second, human attitudes toward those intricacies. I've been intrigued for a long time not only by the sinister beauty of the Black Widow, but also by my own and your reactions to it. I'm fascinated not only with the Galapagos marine iguana as it sails through the sky on page 161, but equally with a young Englishman who got it airborne, and with a cluster of human ideas and attitudes closely connected to that flight. Human aptitudes towards the Black Widow spider and the marine iguana, if you like. It is all ineluctably connected. Apropos to the matter of attitudes, this is the place to insert a quote. I think I could turn and live with animals, they are so placid and self-contained, wrote Walt Whitman. I stand and look at them long and long. I mentioned it in the past, but I really love the way David Quammen writes, and there's a couple pieces in this book that I want to quote because it really exemplifies the way that he writes and why I really enjoy it. So, in one of the essays titled The Ontological Giraffe, which starts on page 77 and lasts until page 83, he describes in the opening to this story a friend who is Norwegian named Leo, who called out and said to Dave, "What's the largest mammal you've never heard of?" Now, Norwegian Leo, as he's called, is a mechanical engineer by profession, a precise and intelligent man of far-ranging but focused enthusiasms. And he goes on and on. I knew he said exactly what he intended to say. I thought passingly about several large-ish animals of the mammalian persuasion. And then he says, then I couldn't help thinking also about Saint Anselm, an 11th century Italian monk with a smart aleck streak who made a name for himself in the history of philosophy by inventing an infuriatingly clever piece of logic called the ontological argument. The ontological argument claims to be a proof for the existence of God, a proof that relies only on pure rational deduction, and believe me, it's as airtight as a can of Spanish peanuts. I had all but forgotten about St. Anselm since the week he gave me a king-size headache during one college term back in 1968, But as I held the receiver to my ear now, I dimly recalled that his ontological argument works from a premise not too unlike, what's the largest mammal you've never heard of? I still didn't know the answer, but since Norwegian Leo, unlike St. Anselm, and for that matter, God, is such a down-to-earth and persuasive presence even over the telephone, I did not doubt for an instant that an answer must exist. Then he goes through, it's not a cetacean. Is it extinct? Living. It's alive and well in the jungles of Central Africa. Duh, I was thinking, I guess, about mastodons. Don't be silly, Dave. You've heard of them. Duh, obviously not the capybara. No, I've heard of them. And besides, they're too small. What's the largest mammal I've never heard of? Correct, a straight question, perfectly fair. I've heard of manatees. Of course, obviously, therefore, not a manatee. And so they go through this list, and he says, the okapi, or however it's pronounced, okapi. Really, okapi are a species of giraffe related to the giraffe, I guess is a better word to say. It's kind of elk-sized, but without the big ol' antlers, and it's incredibly elusive. It took really late into the colonial period, I think even past that, for their existence to even be proven by European scientists. They were known to the local natives of Africa, the indigenous folks where they come from, the okapi, I mean. So I do want to clarify, it wasn't known to Europeans for the most part. And then he says, personally, I have never seen an okapi, not even in a zoo. My modest research has led me to published descriptions and anecdotes, most second and third hand, to a few grainy photographs, and more often, for some reason, to paintings and drawings. After 3 days of this, it occurred to me that the okapi might not exist. Where is the proof, ontological or otherwise? I certainly haven't seen any. And so it's a really funny little discussion about the ontological argument and also the existence of a mammal he's never really heard of. And he ends this section with, yes, I suspect the okapi does exist. That's not the issue. There was this other bit of data tucked in among all the bizarre and less bizarre facts I had been combing through in my sources. One phrase, and the weight is about 250 kilograms. Another authority, more conservative, makes that 200 to 250, in other words, roughly 500 pounds. I think closer to 550. But this great moose-like, horse-shaped, zebra-striped, short-necked giraffe, which I had envisioned bashing its way crazily through the Zyrian bush, kicking out radiators and tumbling thunderously into pitfalls, turns out to be the same size as an elk, like I pointed out earlier. A smallish female. Leo had led me astray. Such a delicate creature couldn't possibly be the largest mammal I've never heard of. That distinction must still belong to the dugong. So that's one example of his writing in this book. And another one in the book Nasty Habits, he's talking about person who writes for the Institute for Creation Research and how this guy is very anti-evolution and how, everything that exists clearly has an intended purpose and that fits the design set aside by God. But then, as David Quammen points out, there are some really weird and exotic creatures, such as how bedbugs reproduce. Bedbugs reproduce by a male finding a female and forcibly inserting its penis into her and then injecting its sperm into the body cavity of the bedbug female. So it just violently stabs into her, and then the sperm travels through the bloodstream until she ovulates and the sperm can fertilize her eggs, and then boom, there's more bed bugs. But then he says that there's another species, Xylocaris maculopenis. This libertine creature is a close relative to the common bedbug, but its own special fame derives from taking traumatic insemination one step beyond. Instead of just stabbing females, X. maculopenis practices homosexual stabbing rape. And so what one male will do is stab another male, insert its sperm into the bloodstream of the secondary male, and then when that secondary male inserts its own penis into a female through traumatic insemination, the sperm of the first bedbug is inserted rather than the sperm of the second victim bedbug male. And so he says that the main point of this is that the traumatic insemination also has a homosexual element to it, which this guy from the Institute for Creation Research probably doesn't like, given that he distributes a book called Bombi the Bombardier Beetle, which is all about how the manner by which bombardier beetles project their spray is too intricate to be caused through evolution. And he says the same publishing house that brought us Bombi has served, by one account, as distributor of a tract titled God's Plan for Insects, and for that matter, another called Unhappy Gaze, but I strongly doubt that either of those comes to grips with the phenomenon of homosexual rape among bedbugs. Ex Macula Penis is another instance of God's wisdom made manifest in the works of creation. I suspect that the sort of God manifested is not the one Duane T. Gish wants. So, the main point being that clearly homosexuality exists in nature, and if animals are designed by God and live according to his designs, then clearly God intended for homosexuality to be a thing. It's David Quammen talking about that without explicitly saying, hey, I'm in favor of homosexuality and I don't think that your views on it are representative of nature, especially if you're trying to use nature to point to God's creationism. So I thought that was a pretty fun article, educational, and talks about homosexuality in a very tongue-in-cheek way. He also does a bit where he's not explicitly talking about nature. He's talking about nature in the same way in the section titled The Moral Ecology of a Desert, the same way he talks about, Christianity and homosexuality in the one I discussed about bedbugs. So in this case, he's discussing immigration across the Mexican border and the deserts of Tucson. The Beaded Lizard has a subtitle, Sanctuary in Tucson, 1984, and he really discusses how people cross the desert and how they are doing so without much preparation, how they are being dropped off and basically left to dehydrate or make it to shelter. He also follows the path of a coyote who, and by coyote I mean the coyote, the guide that transports immigrants, and how at one point the guide hisses avion, which is a plane, and they dive under the thickest clumps of mesquite, smashing themselves into the dry branches, flattening down against leaf litter and gravel, cowering there as a small plane passes low over the canyon. Border Patrol, most likely. It all seems so much like a game, so much like a television melodrama, that the journalist has to remind himself consciously, this isn't hide and seek. People could go to jail. People could die. Very possible. These 4 people here, they could be caught and deported and then murdered. Very possible. He has to remind himself that the invisible menace out here today is not fantastical and not herpetological. This isn't a nature hike. So he discusses that one, and he ends up working with Jim Corbett. Near the end of this segment, in another essay titled The Desert is a Mnemonic Device, he says, in regards to Jim Corbett's effort to protect and to rescue these immigrants who are going through the desert and facing extreme hardship. This is before, decades before they were picked up as soon as they crossed the border. These are people that were expected to, if they were going to do this illegally, they were going to have to go through extreme hardship to get somewhere secure, somewhere that can offer them shelter. And it says, now this may all sound quixotic, or woolly to you or me, but Jim Corbett happens to be the sort of stubborn Quaker moralist who turns Quixotic notions into acts. Goat Walking was written in the late 1970s, several years before Corbett met his first Salvadoran refugee. Then, when the need arose for a desert-smart guide who could lead terrified fugitives through wilderness and across a border, circumventing the armed minions of national policy as distinct from law, he was decidedly ready. He knew how. And so he discusses, really, this guy's Quixotic efforts to help these immigrants. And for the most part, what he is trying to emphasize is that at the time, the path was across open desert and was very dangerous, and a few remote churches offered shelter and were permitted to offer shelter because they were kind of untouchable. And in the 2000s and 2010s, there were some Christians, some realistically devout and proper Christians, were offering aid to migrants crossing through the desert and were getting in trouble legally for leaving water and food for these people that would otherwise starve or dehydrate and die in the wilderness. That they were offering only the basest of necessities and were being arrested for it. And that's really what Jim Corbett is doing, and it's really sad, and personally, I find that to be really sympathetic. They discuss the sentencing of Reverend Fife and 7 other convicted refugee smugglers was held in early July 1986, the same week as that great orgy of self-congratulation by which some Americans celebrated the centennial of the Statue of Liberty. Fife was eligible for as much as 15 years in prison, but the other defendants faced between 5 and 25. Each of them was given a suspended sentence and a period of probation. Evidently, such treatment is usual for first offense cases under the laws in question. But the real drama had always lain in Central America, where non-combatants are still being killed, and in the deportation policies enforced by our government against refugees of some nationalities but not others. The Tucson defendants had never forgotten that, and so they were relieved at the relative leniency they received, but not jubilant. There had been no leniency and no suspension of sentence, after all, for the terrified people who faced deportation. And so he's framing a lot of this through the lens of a nature writer, and I don't know necessarily in what magazine he published this, because he does specify in the introduction not all of this was published under the articles that he posts in Outside Magazine that were published in other magazines. So I really appreciate someone who works in that way, and he frames it in his own writing style that is usually going off on different anecdotes and different explanations, but brings it back to a single focused topic. There's almost 30 essays in this book, and I covered not even a tenth of the essays in this book. I really recommend you picking it up if you like David Quammen's writing, or if any of this writing seems like the sort that you would really like. Now, this book is only about 280 pages long. That means that of the 29 essays, they average about 9, almost 10 pages. Yeah, I really like this book. I really like this writer, and I think if you are the sort that like this style of writing, you would like it too. I don't know how much I paid for this or where I picked up this book, but I highly recommend it regardless. And I would buy it new, having read the Boilerplate Rhino, and that serving as an introduction to David Quammen. I would pick up other collections of his for full price. They're just that fun to read. So yeah, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.